Welcome, deer hunters, managers, and enthusiasts. This is Deer University, the podcast of the Mississippi State University Deer Lab. My name is Bronson Strickland.
And I'm Steve Damaris. Bronson and I are professors of wildlife management and co-directors of the MSU Deer Lab. Together, we've researched deer across the United States for more than 40 years. In our podcasts, we explain the why and how of deer management based on science. Whether it's research we've conducted or explaining research done elsewhere, we'll offer you a college course in the science of deer management.
But don't let Steve scare you. This isn't going to be a review of calculus or chemistry. Instead, we take results of research, reduce it to what's important, and explain how you can apply research to management. So join us for this episode of Deer University.
Welcome back to Deer University. It's a hot summer day here in Mississippi, and we're sitting around in a nice, cool recording studio. We being me, Steve Damaris.
Oh, you're pitching that over to me. Yeah, and me, Bronson Strickland.
And me, Marcus Lashley.
We have a really interesting topic related to the heat of the summer today. We're going to talk generally about the summertime and what it means for an animal, for our deer, and what we should be doing, worrying about in terms of the habitat requirements for those deer. So I thought we'd start out with just a conversation about what happens to plants during the progression from spring into summer, and why is that something we need to worry about?
That sounds like a good topic for Marcus to address.
I thought I might get brought in on that one. Yeah, so in general, most people are familiar with the term green up. So in the springtime, when everything starts getting green, we have this nice pulse of high nutrition availability. So the tender succulent leaves that are growing out of the plants are really high quality, and deer love them. That's a really good time for the deer, and it's normally late gestation. As you go through the summer, most plants start to mature and then start senescing. Maybe in Mississippi, that'd be mostly in July. We start seeing this fairly rapid decline in quality of the leaves. So you may have an abundance of green leaves around, but they're relatively low quality, especially in terms of what is demanded by the deer at that time. So without some intervention with disturbance or something, that's the natural progression you would expect in the plants, in the environment that they're eating.
So Marcus, if a plant, and you can probably think of examples, if a plant kept growing the entire warm season, at least the growing parts, the newer parts of the plant are always going to be high quality.
Yep.
The issue is that a lot of these plants, midsummer or so, the term you used was senesce, or grow old, stop growing.
Right.
Kind of like what
So
Steve...
essentially,
I was going to say, no Steve jokes on that.
we were all thinking it.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sure the listeners were thinking it.
They saw it coming too, yeah. But the issue is when the plant essentially stops growing, that's when quality diminishes.
Yeah, and there are some plants that don't conform to the usual, but most plants have this period of plant growth, so they're growing tissue, and then they flower after they're done growing that tissue, like leaves and elongation of the stem, that sort of thing. So that's what we're talking about with senescing. Once they have stopped growing new plant parts and then go to flower, they typically start declining at that point. Not all plants are like that, and some plants may not even germinate and start growing until midsummer, but most of the plants in the environment and in most parts of the country follow that pattern.
So what would be, you mentioned disturbance, what would be for native plants, what would be a good form of disturbance?
Of course, it would be fire.
Oh, okay.
But if you have a tractor with a disc behind it, that could serve a similar purpose. Although you typically would be focusing on annuals responding, so annual plants responding to the disking, whereas you may have a combination of annual and perennial plants responding to the fire.
And
It really, weather phenomenon. I mean, generally you're going to get this senescence, this old stoppage of new growth. But if you get a good rain during the summertime, I've gone out after a good rain and seen fresh growing tips.
Sure.
So if you get regular summer rains, this isn't as much of a problem.
Well, and a compounding effect of rain is there are numerous plants that are sitting around waiting on there to be enough water, and you may get a lot of the annual forbs in particular after rains, and maybe some grasses as well, that you wouldn't have gotten during a more droughty year. So you definitely see a much higher resource availability on a wet year than you would in a dry year.
So we've done a lot of vegetation sampling across Mississippi in different soil regions during the springtime, targeting at that spring green up you talked about, and then that senescent period in late July. We've sampled the same sites, same plants, and we've shown that for key deer forages, a variety of them, they're consistently really high in the spring from a standpoint of crude protein. Many of them in the mid-20s, some even up into near 30% crude protein. And then it's amazing, you drop down into summertime and those senescent plants are now 10 to 15% protein. So we're talking about almost a 50% drop in crude protein values. So this is a significant event.
Yep.
It's not
Well,
just...
that reminds me, Steve, too, of that would be a seasonal effect going from spring into summer. But Marcus is part of a study with our pal Craig where you had an annual effect. So you had a normal year. I don't know if it's say a wet year. You had a normal year and you had a drought year.
Yeah, so we were up in the southern Appalachians, I think it was 2007, and I'm not sure if it's still the record, but at the time it was the driest year that we had ever recorded in that region. And I happened to have been collecting forage quality data on an array of species that deer like to eat, and I was also doing bite count surveys where I was trying to estimate diet selection of the different species and see basically what is deer preference in that environment. And we ended up with this nice natural study that during one year we had a normal year, and then the other year on the same sites we had an extreme drought. And we did see the drought had a substantial negative effect on most forages. I think the beggar's lice was the only one that was able to withstand it and maintain a relatively similar quality, which of course is a really high quality deer food. But the other thing that we saw happen is deer, responded to that situation by narrowing their diet selection to only focus on a few plants that were meeting their requirements.
And then one of my personal experience from my master's, we're talking, seasonal and then annual. Of course, you're in a place where it rains. Where I did my master's, it sometimes doesn't rain.
Yep.
And I had a wet year, above average precipitation, and that was immediately following a normal year, which means essentially no rain. But whereas in your case, Marcus, you had the similar plant community, you just had differences in quality and probably biomass. They just didn't even exist. It was just brush and dirt, cactus, dirt. And then you get the rain and you get, there's more forage that the deer herd can eat. So real different scenarios here. And yeah.
So we have these changing plant communities and conditions that we can tweak, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit, but let's talk now within this context of changing habitat quality into the summer. Let's talk about what the deer, what's happening with the deer. So like right now in June, bucks are about halfway through with their antler growth. And halfway through is okay. They've got their main beams pretty much established. They're starting to put tines up. But they have a lot of room still to grow, and it's a really critical time coming up for buck antler development. And does are in their, here in Mississippi, they're in their later stages of gestation. And during that later third of gestation, their protein requirements associated with fawn production go up about 5-fold on a daily basis because of the addition of new tissue in those that fetal growth. It's really amazing, the demands. And so the bucks are gonna double their antler size over the next month. The does are in late gestation, 5-fold increase in protein, and then once they give birth, they've got lactation for 3 months. And research done at some other universities up north has shown that lactation is an extremely demanding, nutritionally speaking, process for the doe. An adult doe that's lactating to support 2 fawns, she's going to, on average, over the course of those 3 months of lactation, she's going to need about 72 pounds of added protein in her diet. Now, that's pure protein. Wow. And if you're talking about a plant community in the summertime that's down to 10 or 12% crude protein, you're talking about she will need to eat almost a ton of extra food to support those 2 fawns compared to if she didn't have those 2 fawns. That's huge. Now, if you're talking about a well-managed habitat that, some of the things we'll talk about in a little bit about tweaking the system and stimulating growth, you can cut that requirement in half. If you've got 20 to 22% crude protein available to them, they only need to eat 800 or 1,000 pounds of extra food. That's still pretty significant increase in the demands. So it's easy for hunters to think, well, I'm worrying about my fall food plots. But we hit pretty hard over the years and podcasts, and we're going to hit it again today, is the importance of worrying about what the deer are eating during the summertime to support that extreme antler growth and hardening and the mineralization, and support the gestation and lactation needs of the does.
Well, and the other thing that always baffles me when I think about it, if the listeners have listened to another one of the podcasts from one of your long-term studies about maternal nutrition and how important that is even to the future offspring's antler development. So, if you're planning you're planning your property out and your habitat management plan and your deer management plan ultimately to produce large, high quality bucks. One thing is to get them to older age, another thing is to feed them well, but a third thing that's often not thought about is how important it was to feed their parents or their mother and their mother's mother well during the summer specifically.
And the effects can last a lifetime. So it's not just an effect you see this fall. It could be an effect you see for the next 5 to 10 years. That's why I know we've talked about it in the past too. If you had X amount of time and money, fill in the blank, whatever that is, 40 hours and $1,000, and I was going to allocate that in May versus allocate that for food plots or habitat management or whatever, or allocate that in September, October, the best thing you could do is allocate it in May to improve nutrition during the growing season and warm season. That'll have the larger effects over a greater amount of time.
And Bronson, you've kind of led the analysis of some of our work years ago looking at cohort effects, and you refer to lasting a lifetime. You kind of remind us about those.
Are you talking about recently, a few years ago, looking at the weather, those type of cohort effects?
Yeah, and looking at how weather, a bad year of weather affects antler development 2 years later for the fawns born during that year.
The problem, Bronson, obviously, is that you have done too much good work. We don't even know which work to draw from.
Which of the brilliant pieces of analysis that we've done?
Which award-winning work are you talking about? It's just hard to keep it straight.
All right. Speaking of award-winning, this guy, Marcus, you probably know this, but our listeners probably don't know this yet. But this guy just recently was on the receiving end of the Quality Deer Management Association's Communication Award. for 2019. And
Correction. The Owl Brothers Deer Manager of the Year.
Okay, you got the Communicators Award last year.
No. Someone else, I'm sure, got that. But
Oh,
I
all right.
just
I'm
wanted to
sorry, I
make sure
can't
it was
keep up with
accurate.
all the awards.
Well, thank you very much.
Maybe you won that award and you don't even realize it because you've won so many awards. That you
Every
can't keep
blind
up with
hog finds an acorn every once in a while. You just got to keep looking for the acorn.
So
Yeah.
we're just so proud to be a part of your communication team and your management team.
Thank you very much. That's team is the right word. Teamwork. So one thing we finished up a few years ago, I guess a little bit of background, the stuff Marcus and Steve and I look at is we're looking at wildlife and deer studies from all over the world and all these different radical environments. And so it's really intuitive to think how winter weather affects moose antlers or affects caribou herd or deer. If you get into the northern part of the U.S. and Canada, it's real obvious. What is not very obvious is when you're in a mild and humid environment in the southeastern U.S. as opposed to in southern Texas where you have a dry environment. You can see how drought would affect those populations. What really hadn't been studied is can annual changes in rainfall and heat, drought, etc. affect Mississippi deer? And so
And deer in the southeast in general. I mean,
deer in the southeast,
Yeah.
absolutely. So we looked at about 25 or so, close to 30 years of data, and correlated it with some different weather patterns, really, really big picture. The one we specifically looked at was called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, but it basically works in conjunction with El Nino, that type of big, huge annual weather system. And what we found out is that, and we only looked at 2.5-year-old bucks, and the reason for that was we wanted to maximize the accuracy of aging because we're using harvested bucks, and we wanted to make sure because we wanted to look at the effect of whether the year the buck was harvested, the year prior, and 2 years prior when it was in the womb during the summer. And what we found out, I'm generalizing here, but one of the strongest effects was not the summertime preceding when that 2-year-old buck was harvested, but all the way back to when it was a buck fawn and even all the way back to when it was in the womb. And so we would call that a cohort effect because it's a weather phenomenon that would be affecting the entire deer population. And then that age class of bucks for that particular year has that effect that we would see that could last for years and years. And it really correlates perfectly with the effects from South Texas as well. And when we start looking at those long-term recapture data sets, is that the year that buck fawn hit the ground, all the way to 4 years later, you still see a correlation in the annual variation in antler size is related back to how much rain and what were environmental conditions in the womb and when it hit the ground. So even in this, what we would think is this really mild environment, we always get rain, got a little too much now in some places of Mississippi. We have this mild winter, but even in this environment, the plant community, like Marcus was referring to, and plant quality can have an effect even here for at least until 2 years of age, and it may last longer.
Yeah.
Probably does.
And it probably does. If we had the type of data that could really measure that, a lot more precisely, you probably could see that.
And you mentioned accuracy of aging. The research wasn't looking at aging accuracy. The reason we chose 2-year-old bucks for the analysis is so that we could be confident of the year that they were born.
Yeah. Sorry if I didn't phrase that correctly. Yeah.
And when we talk about a cohort effect, we're talking about the group of animals born in a year, and then we can follow that cohort through multiple years as long as we can accurately age them if we haven't put a tag in their ear.
Like in the coming months, we will have the 2019 cohort of bucks and does that we can follow through their lifetime.
Yeah. So we see this vegetation, this habitat quality that's declining from spring to summer. We've got these annual variations in it. So seasonal variation, annual variation is a lot of moving parts to, Mother Nature is going to try to, she's not really trying to stick it to us as far as deer biologists, but it just happens. Stuff happens. Natural environmental variation of and we as biologists want to acknowledge that and then try to minimize it. Try to minimize the effects of these annual and seasonal changes. And we have a lot of tools to do that.
Sure.
And one of them is food plots. And Bronson, you've led a lot of research on food plot analyses, and Marcus has too since he's been here. And why don't we talk about food plots as kind of an easy, maybe the easier to put your mind around. I've got a piece of ground and I can go plant something.
Yep.
Okay, well, we can never, you're never going to catch any of us talking about food plots without first saying what?
They're supplemental
nutrition.
They're supplemental food plots.
Yes. Supplemental to good, sound habitat management.
And you know what, though? I'm glad both of you said that. That's actually not what I was looking for.
No.
I was actually looking for, before we talk about food plots and what to plant, we first
soil test.
take a soil test.
Okay.
That's right. And we actually have an app for that, by the way. We have a food plot app we need to remind people that they can use. But yeah, so the very first thing you can always do, and you would be surprised, you guys probably would not be surprised, but typically after someone will say, what's the best plant, the best forage to plant, they'll often follow up with, how much fertilizer does it need? What kind of fertilizer do I put on it? And then I always respond with, take a soil test. It'll say exactly on there the NPK you have in your soil and the NPK you need to optimize plant growth. So let's assume you have corrected your pH and you have your fertilization recommendations ready to roll. Warm season, like we said previously, is really, really important. And so we want to get as much biomass of really high quality protein. We always look at protein. There's a lot of other things as well, but we typically focus on protein. And typically all the other stuff kind of goes along with it. Usually when you have a good plant, high in protein, all the other goodies are there with it.
I think we'll get more in the weeds about that in a few minutes. But
Okay,
yeah,
all right.
From a simplistic point of view, we're thinking about protein.
Yeah. The single best in the Southeast for someone with, I would say, average agronomic skills would be planting forage soybeans. And a lot of people may ask, what about alfalfa? And I think alfalfa is a fantastic plant, but it's just a lot harder. It's just a lot more finicky soil conditions.
It's an unbelievable plant in the upper Midwest.
Yeah.
And in some areas of West Mississippi and in the Delta, I mean, phenomenal growth.
Yeah, but I think only, was there like 100 acres in Mississippi or something like that, Bronson? Do you remember what the numbers are? It's not that much of alfalfa.
Yeah, there are a few MSU properties I know that plant it, but they have...
working on new varieties that better tolerate the conditions here.
Yeah.
But although there are a few examples where people are very successfully grow alfalfa in Mississippi or in the South, for the most part, that's not a very good choice, just because of the maintenance and the issues that you get with it.
Yeah.
You just about need to be able to make your living. You have such good agronomic and planting skills that's kind of what it takes. And yeah, our soils, the clay soils and the rainfall and a moist soil, can be tough on it. So let's just say if you could plant alfalfa, that would be a fantastic forage. So we have forage soybeans, and the reason I say forage soybean versus regular conventional soybean is we're looking to maximize forage. We're not looking to maximize grain production, even though that is important. We're looking to maximize forage. Now, if this is such a wonderful plant, and it is, why doesn't everyone plant it? It's really difficult because it's an ice cream plant, and the deer love it so much. It is so good as soon as it emerges from the soil that it can just be, we say over-browsed, but essentially wiped out before it gets ankle high. And so then you have to move into, if you want to continue to plant soybean, then you're going to have to either drastically reduce your deer density, you're going to have to drastically increase the acreage that you're planting soybean. So don't even think about 5 acres or less on your average deer density in the southeast. Typically a big warm season soybean plot, you're probably looking at starting at 10, and you might need closer to 15 to 20 acres. Now, what a lot of people do and have done successfully, some people I've worked with and been really proud of them and has been very successful, is they may only have a 3 to 5 acre soybean plot, but they will fence it with electric fencing. And generally what we say is wait till the beans get knee high, and then you can lower the fence and let the deer eat it. And typically, if you have the right rainfall and growing conditions, typically at that point, the bean growth will keep up with the deer browsing, unless, again, you're really out of balance. If you start to see it being over-browsed, put your fence back up.
Let it recover a little bit.
Yeah.
And when you say electric fence, that might scare some people off, but we're not talking about 12 strands, electrical fence, electrified, warning. I mean, it's, you go down to your county co-op feed store, and for $200-300 you can buy some. I might be being overly technical. We call it the poly tape and poly wire, but we're talking about that 3-strand staggered configuration where you have 1 strand on the outside, and then typically you go in about 2 feet, and then you have 2 strands, and deer can figure it out. We've seen that firsthand, haven't we?
Oh, yeah.
Deer can figure it out, but it takes them a little while, and it kind of provides what we think a little bit of an optical illusion for them. They immediately have this 1 strand, and then there's 2 more behind it, and they really can't navigate to jump in between the 2 sets, and so a lot of times it messes with their sensory perception. And in some situations it works really good, and other times you'll find 1 or 2 deer that'll breach it and figure it out.
When we started crunching the numbers on some of the different exclosures that I've had experience with, where we were actually monitoring deer activity inside and outside, we typically reduce deer activity by about 75 or 80%, and a large portion of what was inside are actually fawns. So
You think they were just scooting under?
I think they just walked under it.
Okay.
So, and probably another, the one that we have the best data on that was actually in the forest, and every time the wind blows, a limb falls on it or something like that. So some of the deer invasion has come, strictly from the fence being down, which may not be a problem in the food plot.
Yeah.
But I think even in our food plot studies, we typically get at least 5 or 10% of the use inside that we see outside.
Yeah, I think this electric wire fencing option is probably generally going to be needed for most food plots. Most of our listeners, they don't have 10 or 20 acres they can put into a forage soybean
if they're
field.
planting soybeans.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's such an ice cream plant.
And I may not have my dimensions exactly right, but so thanks for bringing that up. That is probably the most common configuration, but there are also some people that, they just, for whatever reason, are not going to be able to plant a 30-acre field or 20-acre field. So they will put up a more permanent form of fence and use something like, we've done with some of our soybean research in the past, they'll use like a 7.5-foot T-post, and drive it in the ground, and then use that plastic woven, I can't say plastic wire, but that plastic fabric
like
type
you see along
mesh.
highway
Yeah.
construction sites and things.
Yeah. And so they'll have that from at the top, 7.5 feet all the way to the ground, and then at some point, then there'll be a break in the middle. They'll pull up the bottom and zip tie it or staple it, such that you have from ground level to 3 or 4 feet open underneath it, and then the deer just learn to come in and go out. But that's a permanent situation.
So back to the electric wire, and it really is simple to do. It's not scary. You mentioned 2 feet separating. I've heard 18 inches. You said 2 feet separating the 3 wires. How tall? How high off the ground are each of those 3 wires?
You're putting me on the spot here, Steve. I believe, gosh, I should look that up. I want to say your outer wire is 18 inches to 24 inches. And I think then your 2 inner it's a little bit lower than your outer. So let's say if your outside wire was 24, you might go 18 and then 36. But essentially, I'm using my hands, and people at home can't see my hands.
It's really clear that when you do that.
Well,
Your outside is kind of in between. If you were looking in the plot, the one closest to you, if you're on the outside, is about halfway in between the inner 2.
I think I don't usually carry a measuring tape around with me, so I typically do it in knee heights. So the outer wire, when I've set them up, I think it was right at kneecap level.
And then the inside were a little below kneecap level.
Maybe like mid shin and then close to your waist.
Yeah.
So.
And then I've had people contact me via email that did it by the book. And there's one big company that's real popular for this setup, and then there's a lot of others that manufacture a very similar product. But they have a pretty specific recipe for do it this way, and I've had a lot of people contact me and say, didn't work that way for me. I had to adjust. I had to move them up or move them down, and so you just kind of have to work with it.
Yeah, we've had some problems in some of our research also with if you have a little bit of terrain, if there's a rise or a dip in the topography or something, especially when you have a little larger plot, you start running into problems, and you need a lot of fence posts.
Yeah.
To deal with it.
To pull the wire back down in those dips or up.
And I've even had a cooperator that showed me a forage soybean field that he used a single wire at about thigh height, and he had an extremely high deer density, and it worked. So
How big was the field?
It was like a 3 to 5 acre field. I can't remember exactly, but I mean, he swore that that single wire kept the deer out till they get up.
Now there is another technique prior to this 3-strand system using a single wire or poly tape or whatever, but you intentionally condition the deer to be shocked. This has been done for raccoons as well. But so one example would be you have that single strand, and then you put a little tab on it and you smear it with peanut butter.
Yeah.
And then you make sure the very first night you do that it's hot.
Yeah.
And every deer that comes up and licks the peanut butter, they get smashed.
Yeah. And he may have done that.
Smashed. They get shocked. They get jolted.
They
pretty
get
good.
jolt.
So, but we don't want to spend too much time on the fence thing. So let's get back to we're putting out some food plots and.
Right. Well, I think the reason that, we're talking about all this fencing and, the soybeans, I think most people would agree, and I certainly think of soybeans this way as the cream of the crop plant. I mean, in terms of diet selection, deer very highly regard, if not, I don't know what the word I'm looking for. I guess they love that plant, and it may be even the top ranked plant in most scenarios.
Absolutely.
And because of that, they will literally eat it to death. So you may need some of this intervention.
Yep.
If I don't especially going to my own family's land, living far away from it, if I was going to plant a summer food plot, I would not pick soybeans because I don't want to have to deal with that.
Yeah.
I just don't have time to go over and check on a fence or turn it on and off and that sort of thing. So in that case, you might pick another plant.
So probably number 2 then in that regard is going to be cowpeas. And so it's another, again, a warm season legume. And the thing about it is you think, well, I can get cowpeas to grow. But you're getting cowpeas to grow because the deer aren't eating them.
Mm-hmm.
And so right when cowpeas are growing, just like when the soybeans are starting to grow, hopefully in May, but maybe you're back until June. But now we're in that critical period that we're talking about. And so we've got May, June, July, and when we really want to be pumping out that forage. And typically cowpeas, now some deer will adapt and hammer it when it comes out of the ground, but usually not. But the bottom line is it's not as palatable, and it becomes more palatable later in the year, in the growing season, and often when it flowers.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So heck, you may be talking about now you're into July or sometimes later, and so you've missed a critical window of time.
Yep.
So you have checked the box that you have a good warm season plant. It's a legume, lots of biomass, but you may have missed 6 weeks when you needed to be providing forage. So a little sidebar here, what I recommend is that if that is the case, then that is when you need a late maturing clover to complement that.
Yeah, from your fall food plot.
Right. And so a berseem or a red clover, those would be my favorites. Balanza is another one of my favorites. It would mature a little bit earlier, but certainly a red clover. Anywhere you're at, you're going to get through the midsummer with red clover. So complement that. Another one then in that more of a viney type legume would be lab. It was really popular in the past. Some people swear by it. Some people don't swear by it.
I have some of my experience during my master's work really opened my eyes about these 3 plants specifically, because part of that study, the same one we talked about, the drought, it was part of this larger study. I went and planted food plots as part of the study with those 3 plants, soybean, lab, and cowpeas in the same plots, where I was measuring forage production and quality and selection of the plants by deer. And it was pretty amazing to me. The lab, no question, outproduced by a large portion the other 2 in terms of biomass produced, and they were all high quality plants. But I saw a very clear progression in that study. Now, we'll talk about this more. This will change with where you are and what the deer nutritional demands are. But in that case, we planted them all, the same day or 2. Soybeans, immediately deer were eating every leaf, on the plants. They made it through. It was a low deer density. They made it through. We didn't need fencing or anything, but they literally, it looked like they just decimated the plants to the level where they were near being eaten, to death, and couldn't find a plant in the 2, in the same plot. We have all 3 planted in their own area, and couldn't find one plant that had been bitten of the cowpeas or lab for about the first month to 6 weeks.
There you go.
And then basically after they had eaten all the leaves off of all the soybeans, it was so funny because we had cages in there, and they look amazing inside the cage, and then outside of it there's no leaves. And then directly beside it, the other 2 look beautiful inside or outside the cage. And all of a sudden, one day, they just decided it's time to eat cowpeas, and they completely just decimated the cowpea plots, which was all late summer. But in that study, we never saw them eat lab. I don't know why. I know I have been in numerous other scenarios and watched them devour lab, but in that context, they did not eat it. That was up in eastern Tennessee where we were doing that study.
And I've heard that repeated other places that, like you said, some people love it, some people don't like it so much because of that off and on again preference on the deer. What about deer vetch? Have you had any experience with that?
One of my so soybean is number one. That would be just absolutely, if you can do that, do that. But my second favorite would be deer vetch. Astronomony, American joint vetch. There's a lot of different names for it, but this is not purple vetch that are in some other mixes. This is different.
Right.
So yeah, deer vetch. Another thing about it is it's going to be a lot more hardy. Once it gets established, deer can eat it and eat it and eat it, and it's typically really, I shouldn't say completely resistant. It could be overbrowsed, but it's really good at handling browse, but it's slow to be established.
Yep.
So whereas you might have soybean jump up and be knee high, your deer vetch may still just be a little over ankle high, so it takes a while. So again, to complement that, have you a clover or something. But then once it gets established, you can bow hunt over it.
Oh yeah.
Until the
I
first
really,
frost.
in terms of a plant that is just widely usable by pretty much anybody that would be listening to this, that's a really good one.
Yep. You can
Because-
broadcast it.
Yeah,
It doesn't have to be drilled. It's not very finicky.
The only problem it has is that slow establishment period, but as soon as it gets established, deer like to eat it. I've never seen it in a place where they did not like to eat it, and it handles browse pressure very well, and it saved us
Yep.
a couple of times now.
The only
Which you can
downside
talk
with
about
it,
that.
what's that?
I was just going to say you could talk about how it saved us in some other scenarios.
I don't know if I remember what you're talking about.
I think it was, well, the last time that it happened was 2 seasons ago. We were going to plant our fall food plots.
Oh,
and
yeah.
we never got any rain.
That's right. So our only fall forage was a warm season deer vetch plot.
And the deer vetch lasted well into bow season. I think it may have even lasted somewhat into rifle season.
Yeah, or early November. Yeah.
Yeah, and
that's
the
right.
deer were just loving it because it was the best thing around to eat, given that we were in extreme drought.
Yeah.
So I think I want to emphasize something that's kind of come to my mind as we've been talking here. One is that there's no single forage to plant in a summer food plot that's going to address all the needs because of all these different considerations. So there's no such thing as a silver bullet, and you want to probably vary what you're planting to take to account for problems that arise with one or the other. So diversify your food plot plantings.
Yep.
And then food plots are highly productive under the right circumstances. You soil test and fertilize, and if it rains the right amount. One of the limitations with food plots is the year that you most need them during a drought, it's the year it's hardest to plant them.
You get the least amount of production.
Yeah.
Or a complete failure.
Or a complete failure. So food plots are great. They're the easy go-to, wrap your mind around it. You got a field here, we can plant it. But that's not our preferred approach to providing good nutrition to a deer population. So why don't we transition from, food plots can be great, diversify them, and you key that word diversify and as a transition into natural habitat. And food plot is also limited in terms of the amount of acreage, but most people have a whole lot more natural habitat than they do food plots. So let's talk about diversifying natural habitat and the larger extent of it. Sure, in natural habitats, you won't probably produce 3,000 or 4,000 pounds per acre like you would on your food plot. But
you have a buffet.
You have a buffet, and you've got a whole lot more acres of it.
I think that's a great point. The importance of diversity cannot be stressed enough. And when you're thinking about a food plot program, most people pick something that they like and they go with that. Bronson, what's your favorite food?
What day of the week is it?
Today. What's
I like steak. I like fish. I
Okay, let's
like a
go with-
cheeseburger. I like a salad.
Let's go with steak. You said that first. So that's your first choice, we'll just say.
Yeah, I'll take a ribeye.
So okay. Ribeye cooked exactly like you like it. What did you eat for lunch today?
I had a salad.
Why didn't you eat steak?
I guess a couple reasons. Probably the economics of it, and a salad is better for me.
Okay.
And I was actually craving a salad today.
Okay.
And where you went, that would probably not be the best place to buy that steak anyway.
So I'm hearing
Yeah.
there's a trade-off to eating steak.
Mm-hmm.
But have you eaten steak this week?
Nope.
What about this month?
I've had venison backstrap.
So
Not quite a ribeye, but
Okay.
yeah.
let's say that we remove all the constraints with availability. You don't have to worry about it financially. Would you just eat steak every time that you ate?
Oh, I would get sick of it. It would be too much of a good thing.
Yeah. I think we fail to realize the same thing is happening with deer.
Mm-hmm.
We want to put something in a feeder, we want to plant one thing in a food plot, and we fail to realize that deer are using different kinds of plants for different reasons, and they're mixing their diet to accomplish different nutritional demands that are constantly fluctuating in the own deer's body. Not only does it vary across individuals, we talked a little bit about the nutritional demands of a deer. Well, the truth is that varies widely by the individual, and it also is a moving target within that individual.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, we have this inherent variability in the environment that causes all these problems. The only way that you really can cause stability in providing high quality nutrition given any circumstances is by diversifying. And I'm not just talking about planting multiple things in your food plots. You really can't even do it that way. It's not possible. We don't even have enough food plot plants to do it the justice that it would need. I mean, deer literally use hundreds of plants throughout a year in any given place.
And everybody's seen it if they think about it.
Yeah.
Even though they're sitting on a food plot, they have seen the buck or the doe meandering down the trail and nipping at every vine and forb, and there's a little bit of blackberry, and they're browsing all this other stuff to satisfy these nutrient demands they need.
Right. Yeah. So I think that is a perfect point to make here. Is we need to understand, just like if we had no constraint, basically that's what we're doing with a soybean food plot. We're basically removing the constraint of needing to find it. We have a high availability to the deer at all times. They still don't eat only soybeans. They diversify their diet. And if it happens to be a droughty year and the soybeans fail, well, it would be a really good thing to have a bunch of good, high-quality forage in the natural habitat that provides things even when it's droughty.
And back to my earlier incorrect statement about which award he'd won. He did win the Al Brothers Deer Management Award, and for listeners, Al, South Texas deer biologist, land manager, known generally as the father of quality deer management. Years ago, as a young professor, I used to take my classes out to his property. And one of the things he always taught my students was manage for the worst years, not for the best years.
That's great advice.
So if you can, under the worst circumstances, the worst years, provide a good diverse habitat for your animals, the best years will just be bumper.
Yeah.
And back to that cohort effect we talked about, you want to avoid the bad years. Well, you manage for those worst years so that there isn't a bad year under the worst of circumstances. And the only way to do that is natural habitat and providing that diversity across your property.
Yeah, that you basically, if you really want to manage well at the peak, you must give the animal the opportunity to mix its diet as it's needed, because every individual is different and it's changing within the individual, and it's changing year to year and week to week. The only way that you can make sure that you satisfy that demand is to allow the animal the choice. They need the buffet.
They need the options.
They need the couple hundred options of native plants in the community. Now, we can supplement that by giving them something that, it's just like ice cream. I love to have a little bit of ice cream with my meal occasionally. Well, we can sort of think of a food plot like that, except in this case it's a really high quality, sort of like a supplement. If you were taking some sort of supplement for nutrient deficiency, it's the same thing with a food plot. We're giving them a high quality option that is supplementing that native habitat, but you cannot meet the needs of every individual with anything.
Yeah.
You have to have that diversity.
So the key is natural habitat diversity with supplemental food plots. And we're kind of running out of time today. We don't have a lot of time to get into, how do you provide that natural habitat diversity. We've certainly talked about that a lot in past podcasts. So we'll refer the listeners to download, if they haven't, earlier podcasts. And talking about time running out, we kind of have a happy, sad situation we want to talk about a little bit. A key member of our MSU Deer Lab has had a wonderful opportunity come up. And Marcus, you want to tell us about your plans?
Yeah, it's as you said, a wonderful opportunity has presented itself, and it's a bittersweet situation. But come August, I will be moving on to the University of Florida. So I will be leaving the MSU Deer Lab to start a deer lab there, hopefully. So, yeah.
We're happy for you. Obviously, we're happy for you.
Well, I appreciate it.
Sad at the same time. We had a great thing going here, and what Marcus did complemented, I think, true synergy when he was here. We just all worked so well together.
Yeah. Well,
So
I think
a fun ride.
The intent is to continue the collaboration. It just will be a little longer distance, and you guys have it really well covered over here. University of Florida did not have anybody that was specializing in game species management, particularly deer management related things, or fire ecology from a wildlife perspective. So hopefully I can help fill that niche. And some of the folks, I know quite a bit of our listeners, because I get emailed from them regularly, or from Florida or South Georgia or South Alabama. So hopefully it'll help us build a larger base that we can help out with some of this information, rather than be a detriment.
Yeah, and I think it's really important. I mean, I hate that you're leaving, but it's so important for you to go to Florida, because many of the soils across Florida are in that lower quality that needs some extra tweaking and extra expertise. And you're going to go down there and you're going to learn new stuff about how to manage Florida soils and habitat. And you're bringing with you a wealth of knowledge from your personal, professional training and what you've learned here. And so Florida, look out.
Here he comes.
He's coming with his drip torch.
Bringing his A game at that.
Yeah, well, I saw the statistics somewhere. I think Florida at least was, and I think it still is, the leader in using prescribed fire. So that's a good place for me in terms of my interest and specialty, and my ability to make an impact on what's happening on the ground. So we don't want to use up all the good ideas and good skill sets here at one place, I guess.
We're going to spread them out.
Yeah, and it's not like we're not going to be able to do habitat work in the future. We're going to be replacing you. Well, we're going to try to find someone that can come in and do some of the things you have done. We can't replace you. You're a unique individual.
Yeah. I'm the only one of me.
Yes, you are.
So I get for our Deer University listeners that have certainly, I just think over the past 2 years, all the great topics you've covered, and my goodness, the mineral stumps, it really took off, and it was just a wonderful idea and concept. So I guess we can say, Marcus, that you are going to be on this podcast numerous times in the future. You just may be doing it via Skype,
Right.
from Florida, or when you're passing through and we do it in person.
Yeah. But for the listeners, I don't see any effective change necessarily. I can be a part of these just the same as I have in the past because of modern technology. So.
And we have that recorded, so we're going to hold you to that.
Well, my intent, so the position, one thing that's changing for me in terms of my career is I will have an extension appointment, which basically right now at Mississippi State I don't. I'm doing this because I personally feel it's my duty to extend knowledge to the public, but there that's part of my job. So, being parts of things like this to extend knowledge to the general landowner, that'll be part of my job. So my intent is to stay involved as long as you guys will have me.
Well, we and the listeners are happy you have that passion and conviction.
Yeah. Well, it's been a real pleasure, and thanks.
Godspeed.
Yeah, I really appreciate it.
Go set fire to something.
Yeah, I'm gonna set fire the whole way down.
Well, so we're going to wrap this one up with a temporary goodbye to Marcus. Bon voyage.
Sure thing. Okay, everyone, that is a wrap. Thanks a lot.
We're glad you joined us today and hope you learned something valuable about deer management. If you have questions about this podcast or a question about a topic we haven't discussed, please log on to msudeerlab.com, click on the Deer University tab, and send us your questions. We'll get to them as soon as possible. In closing, we want to thank our employers, the Mississippi State University Extension Service and the Forest and Wildlife Research Center. We also want to thank the St. John and Dudley Hutchinson families for their endowments that support deer research and education.